The difference between a small mistake and a life-changing mistake is usually whether somebody is willing to admit they're wrong. My neighbors built part of their dream home on my land, not by 10 feet, not by 3 feet, but by 6 inches, and by the time they finally understood why that mattered, it had already cost them more than $100,000. The crazy part is that I tried to stop it before it ever became a problem. My name is Ethan Walker, and the land at the center of this mess sits outside a little farming community in western Tennessee. Nothing special to look at if you're driving by. Just 5 narrow acres stretching from a county road back toward a creek lined with sycamore trees. Most of it is woods. No lake. No mountain views. No luxury cabins. Just quiet land that had been in my family for decades. My father bought it in 1984 when land prices out there were practically being given away. He was a mechanic who worked 6 days a week and saved every extra dollar he could. He used to tell me that land was the one thing nobody could make more of. So if you ever got a chance to own some, you held on to it. When he passed away, that property became mine. I wasn't living on it. I wasn't developing it. Honestly, most years I only walked the entire boundary a few times. But I knew every corner marker, every old survey pin, every tree line that marked where my family's property ended and somebody else's began. That mattered later. For years I barely had neighbors. The parcel beside mine sat empty. Then one spring, everything changed. A couple named Trevor and Madison Cole bought the property next door. You know the type. Young, successful, remote workers from Portland who had spent a few years watching homestead videos online and suddenly decided they wanted chickens, gardens, sunsets, and a simpler life. At first, I liked them. Seriously, they seemed friendly enough. The first time we met, Trevor walked over carrying 2 coffees and introduced himself. "We're escaping civilization," he joked. I laughed and said, "Give it 6 months. You'll be begging for a decent pizza delivery." We both laughed. Nice interaction. Normal interaction. Nothing that suggested we'd eventually end up fighting each other in court. Within weeks, they hired an architect, then surveyors, then contractors, then excavators. Soon there were trucks rolling down the road every morning before sunrise. Massive equipment, concrete deliveries, lumber stacked everywhere. The kind of project where you can practically hear money being spent. They weren't building a cabin. They were building a showcase property. Every few days, Madison posted updates online. Dream homestead progress. Country life journey. Building our forever home. People online loved it. The photos looked beautiful. Fresh concrete. Wood framing. Golden sunsets behind construction equipment. The whole thing looked like a magazine article about leaving city life behind. Meanwhile, I mostly stayed out of the way. It wasn't my project. It wasn't my business. At least that's what I thought. One afternoon, I was walking my property line after a storm. A few branches had come down near the boundary, and I wanted to make sure nothing had blocked the drainage ditch along the edge of my woods. That's when I noticed something. The corner of their foundation looked close. Really close. At first, I thought maybe it was an optical illusion. Property lines can play tricks on you. Distances look different once buildings go up. But the longer I stared at it, the more something felt wrong. I walked into the trees and found the old iron survey pin. Exactly where I expected it to be. I brushed leaves away from it and stood there for a minute. Then I looked toward the foundation again. My stomach sank. The concrete corner wasn't near the property line. It was over it. Not much. Just a few inches. But enough. I walked around it twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Then I grabbed a tape measure. 6 inches. 6 inches onto my property. Now here's the thing people don't understand. The size of an encroachment doesn't matter nearly as much as the principle behind it. If somebody parks one tire on your lawn for 5 minutes, that's annoying. If somebody permanently builds part of $1 million structure on your land, that's completely different. Because once that structure exists, fixing the problem gets exponentially more expensive every single day. I figured it was probably an honest mistake. So I went looking for Trevor. He was standing near the foundation wearing expensive work boots and talking with one of the contractors. When he saw me walking over, he smiled. "How's it looking?" he asked proudly. I pointed toward the corner of the foundation. "You've got a problem." His smile faded. "What kind of problem?" "Your foundation crossed onto my property." For a second, he looked confused. Then he pulled out his phone. Not a survey. Not construction documents. A property app. He zoomed in and showed me colorful lines on a screen. According to that app, everything was fine. I remember looking at him, and thinking he genuinely believed it. The problem was that those apps can be off by 10 feet or more. I explained that. Calmly. Patiently. I even pointed toward the actual survey marker. But Trevor just shrugged. Those old markers have probably shifted over time. I stared at him. No, I said. They haven't. He laughed. Actually laughed. Then he said something that stuck with me. It's 6 inches, Ethan. Nobody's going to care. Maybe he thought I was bluffing. Maybe he thought I didn't understand property law. Maybe he thought the project had already become too expensive to stop. Whatever the reason, he wasn't taking me seriously. And standing there looking at that concrete foundation crossing onto land my father bought 40 years earlier, I realized something that made me uneasy. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation. This was going to become a fight. And unfortunately for Trevor, he had just made the worst possible decision because he wasn't listening. The next week, I decided to give Trevor every opportunity to fix the problem before lawyers got involved. Looking back, that's probably the part of the story that frustrates me the most, because people sometimes assume I immediately ran to court over 6 inches of land. The truth is exactly the opposite. I spent weeks trying to keep this from becoming a legal battle. I printed copies of both property surveys, highlighted the boundary lines, marked the location of the iron survey pin, and even spoke with an old surveyor named Hank Morrison who had worked in the county for nearly 30 years. Hank took one look at the documents and said, "If that foundation crossed the pin, they're on your land. Doesn't matter if it's 6 inches or 6 feet. That was all I needed to hear. A few days later, I walked over to the construction site again. The foundation had already cured and framing lumber was stacked everywhere. Trevor was talking to a subcontractor when he saw me coming. The smile disappeared from his face before I even reached him. He knew exactly why I was there. I handed him the survey documents. Take a look at these. He barely glanced at them. We've already checked everything. No, you checked a phone app. Same difference. I actually laughed when he said that because I couldn't believe a grown man spending over $1 million on a custom home was trusting an app more than legal surveys. Trevor, stop construction for a couple days and get a licensed survey crew out here. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize and leave you alone. He crossed his arms. And if you're right, then you fix it before the house gets any further along. He shook his head immediately. We're too far into this project to stop now. I looked behind him at the partially framed structure. They weren't too far into anything. At that point, it would have been expensive, sure, but manageable. What made it dangerous was continuing after being warned. Then came the moment that changed everything. Trevor looked at me and said, "Why don't we just move the property line?" Like he was suggesting we switch tables at a restaurant. I honestly thought he was joking. Move the property line? Yeah, we'll pay for the paperwork. I'll give you $1,000 for the inconvenience. $1,000. That's what he thought my family's property rights were worth. Not because he needed the land. Not because the land had value to him by itself. Because fixing his mistake would cost more than buying my cooperation. I remember staring at him for several seconds before answering. No. His expression hardened. Why not? Because it's my land. It's 6 inches. It's still my land. He let out a long, frustrated sigh. You're being unreasonable. That word stuck with me. Unreasonable. The guy who built part of his house on someone else's property was calling me unreasonable. Then he walked away while I was still standing there. Construction resumed the next morning. Nail guns, concrete trucks, delivery crews. Everything continued as if our conversation had never happened. That's when I realized Trevor wasn't making a mistake anymore. He was making a calculated decision. He believed that if he finished enough of the house, no judge would ever force him to deal with the encroachment. A lot of people think that way. They assume a court will look at the cost of fixing a problem and decide the victim should simply accept compensation. Unfortunately for Trevor, courts don't like people who knowingly create problems and then argue that fixing them is too expensive. I contacted an attorney named Rebecca Gaines. Rebecca was one of those lawyers who never raised her voice and never seemed impressed by anything. I explained the situation and handed her the documents. She spent 10 minutes reviewing everything before saying, "Did you notify them?" "Twice." "Do you have proof?" "Emails, text messages, and witnesses." She smiled. "Good." A formal demand letter went out the following week. It wasn't aggressive. It simply stated the facts. Their foundation crossed the property boundary. They had been notified. Construction should stop immediately until the issue was corrected. A reasonable person would have viewed that letter as a warning flare. Trevor viewed it as an annoyance. 2 weeks later, Rebecca received a response from their attorney. The argument was exactly what you'd expect. The encroachment was minimal. No meaningful damage existed. Forcing demolition would create an unfair financial burden. They proposed a permanent easement and offered $5,000. $5,000. Apparently, my land had become more valuable since Trevor's first offer. Rebecca slid the letter across her desk toward me. What do you think? I pushed it back. No. She nodded. I thought so. Am I being stubborn? Rebecca leaned back in her chair. Do you know what the biggest problem is with people who intentionally ignore property boundaries? What's that? They almost never stop with one boundary. That sentence stayed with me. Because she was right. If somebody learns they can take 6 inches today, what stops them from taking another 6 inches tomorrow? The lawsuit was filed shortly afterward. That's when the waiting game began. Court cases move slower than people imagine. While lawyers exchanged documents and survey reports, life continued. Seasons changed. Leaves turned brown. Winter arrived. And right in the middle of all that, Trevor and Madison finished their dream house. I'll admit it was beautiful. Huge wraparound porch. Stone fireplace. Expansive windows facing the woods. Every few days, Madison posted new photos online. First family dinner in our forever home. First Christmas at the homestead. Living the dream. Thousands of likes. Hundreds of comments. People telling them how inspiring they were. What nobody online knew was that a lawsuit was quietly moving through the court system at the exact same time. Sometimes I'd see those posts and shake my head. Not because I was jealous. Not because I wanted them to fail. But because I couldn't understand how somebody could spend every day enjoying a house while knowing part of it sat on land they didn't own. Meanwhile, Rebecca was building the case piece by piece. Survey reports. Expert opinions. Timeline evidence. Copies of every warning. Every email. Every letter. Every conversation. The turning point came during a deposition. Trevor was asked when he first became aware of the potential encroachment. He admitted it happened during our first conversation near the foundation. Then he admitted I had shown him the survey pin. Then he admitted I had returned with survey documents. Then he admitted receiving the attorney demand letter. I remember Rebecca calling me afterward. Well, I asked. He just handed us the case. Because from that moment forward, the issue wasn't accidental construction anymore. It became deliberate negligence. He knew. He continued anyway. 8 months after the lawsuit began, we finally arrived at the hearing. I still remember walking into that courtroom. Trevor looked exhausted. Madison looked nervous. Their attorney looked like he already knew how this was going to end. The judge spent hours reviewing testimony, surveys, correspondence, and expert reports. Then came the question that changed everything. What was the value of the land required to resolve the encroachment? Most people assume 6 inches of dirt can't possibly be worth much. That's where they misunderstand the law. The issue wasn't the dirt. The issue was that part of a permanent structure depended on property they didn't own. And once the court-appointed appraiser explained that distinction, I could see Trevor's confidence begin to disappear. The appraiser's testimony lasted less than an hour, but it completely changed the atmosphere in the courtroom. Up until that point, Trevor seemed convinced the judge would eventually force both sides into some kind of compromise. Maybe a few $1,000s. Maybe a small easement. Maybe a lecture about neighbors getting along. What he wasn't expecting was for a licensed valuation expert to explain that the 6 inches themselves weren't what carried the value. The value came from the fact that a permanent residential structure depended on that land for legal compliance. Once that reality entered the record, the conversation stopped being about dirt and started being about leverage. I watched Trevor's face as the numbers were discussed. At first he looked confused, then concerned, then genuinely scared. The judge reviewed every warning he had received, every opportunity he had been given to correct the issue, every document showing he knowingly continued construction after learning about the encroachment. That last part mattered more than anything. If this had been an honest mistake discovered after construction was complete, the outcome might have been very different. But that's not what happened. He knew. He gambled. And now the bill was coming due. A week later, the ruling was issued. I was sitting in Rebecca's office when she called me into the conference room. She slid the decision across the table and smiled before I even started reading. Well, I asked. Read it. So I did. The court ruled that Trevor and Madison had knowingly continued construction after multiple warnings. The encroachment created a permanent legal burden on my property. The judge approved compensation valued at $75,000 plus reimbursement of my legal expenses. Alternatively, they could enter into a mandatory easement agreement requiring annual payments that would continue indefinitely. I read the numbers twice, then a third time, not because I didn't understand them, but because I knew exactly what Trevor was feeling when he saw them. Shock. Pure shock. A few days later, there was one final settlement meeting. Trevor looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Madison sat quietly beside him. Gone were the social media smiles, the excitement, the dream homestead energy. Reality had finally arrived. Their attorney argued that the amount was excessive. Rebecca calmly pointed out that they had ignored warnings for months. Trevor finally looked directly at me and said something I hadn't expected. "You really wouldn't let this go, would you?" The room got quiet. I looked back at him and said, "I tried to let you fix it." He didn't answer, because there wasn't really anything left to say. We both knew how many chances he had been given. We both knew exactly when this could have been avoided. In the end, they chose the lump sum option. $75,000 for the easement rights, roughly $18,000 in legal fees, additional survey expenses, recording fees, document preparation costs, and various administrative expenses that piled up along the way. By the time everything was finished, the total exceeded $100,000. All because of 6 inches. The funny thing is people hear that and immediately focus on the measurement. 6 inches. 6 inches. 6 inches. But that was never the real story. The real story was pride. The real story was a man being warned repeatedly and deciding he knew better than surveys, lawyers, survey markers, and common sense. The real story was what happens when somebody believes finishing a mistake will somehow make it disappear. About a year later, I drove past the property one afternoon. The house was still beautiful. The porch was still immaculate. The landscaping had matured. From the road, it looked like the perfect rural dream people spend years chasing. And maybe it still was. But I couldn't help remembering that one conversation beside the foundation when Trevor laughed and said nobody would care about 6 inches. Turns out somebody cared. The county cared. The court cared. The survey cared. And eventually his bank account cared too. These days we don't talk much. We're civil. We wave if we happen to cross paths. Life moves on. That's usually how these stories end in the real world. No dramatic revenge. No shouting match. No celebration. Just consequences. Quiet, expensive consequences. And every time I walk my property line and pass that old iron survey marker, I think about how differently things could have turned out if somebody had simply stopped for one day and listened. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have accepted the money and adjusted the property line from the beginning? Or would you have fought to protect your property rights no matter how small the encroachment was? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with difficult neighbors, boundary disputes, or somebody who thought the rules didn't apply to them, share your story below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around for the next one, because sometimes the smallest mistakes end up creating the biggest consequences.